The day the floating captions returned, I was standing in the school courtyard watching seniors rehearse graduation songs, pretending I wasn't counting every coin in my pocket. The captions didn't appear in the sky like magic. They appeared inside my vision like an overlay thin white lines, as if someone had placed subtitles on the world and forgotten to turn them off. At first I thought exhaustion had finally broken something in my brain. Then the words began to react to people, not to me. When the principal shook hands with donors, the overlay flashed. Smiling for cameras, thinking about rankings, worrying about a leaked list. When a teacher praised a student, the overlay added, "He's not the one they're protecting." I blinked hard. The captions stayed. I looked away. They followed. It wasn't a hallucination that faded when I rested. It was a system, and it had just logged in. My name is Lan Fuang, scholarship kid, class monitor. The one teachers called a good example because I never complained. I came from a fishing village where storms could erase a year's savings in one night. My father's back was ruined by years of lifting nets, and my mother's hands were always raw from salt water and detergent. I earned a place at Meridian Academy, an elite private school in the city, because I scored first in the provincial exams. The brochure said Meridian welcomed talent from all backgrounds. The contract in the scholarship office said Meridian owned my time. I had to maintain top grades, represent the school at events, tutor students on demand, and never damage the institution's reputation. Reputation, I learned, was just another word for obedience. People at Meridian liked to talk about opportunity the way they talked about marble floors as something that existed because the school was generous, not because someone else had paid for it. My week was a ledger. Wake before dawn. Ride 2 buses. Arrive early to open the classroom windows. Sit through lessons without letting my hunger show, then spend the afternoon tutoring in the library while wealthy students complained that the air conditioning was too cold. On Fridays there were donor dinners, and scholarship students were expected to smile in the background like proof that the institution had a soul. We rehearsed gratitude speeches the way others rehearsed debate. Carefully, strategically, with the knowledge that one wrong tone could be interpreted as attitude. I learned which adults were safe and which were decorative. Safe adults asked what I needed. Decorative adults asked what story I could provide. I learned to keep my receipts for everything. Bus fare, uniforms, textbooks, because a scholarship can be revoked for the vague crime of being uncooperative. And poverty is always assumed to be a choice. My classmates carried snacks and lip balm. I carried a folder of forms. That folder was my insurance policy. It also made me feel old in a way that had nothing to do with age. I didn't come to Meridian to be brave. I came to survive long enough to leave. As class monitor, I was the one who stayed after lessons to lock projectors, return attendance sheets, and escort visiting parents to the right hallway. The school called it leadership training. It was unpaid labor disguised as prestige. When teachers praised my responsibility, I smiled because smiling kept doors open. At night, when my roommates slept, I reviewed policy clauses on my cracked phone screen, not because I loved rules, but because rules were the only language Meridian respected when it wanted something from you. The overlay didn't show up when I was happy. It showed up when I was cornered. That afternoon, a secretary handed me a note. Meet in room 3B after last bell. It was signed with a stamp, not a name. Room 3B was the counseling office, where students went when they cried too loudly to hide it. Room 3B smelled like peppermint tea and disinfectant, the kind of gentle scent used to convince you a place is safe. The posters on the wall were all soft colors and soft promises. Breathe, speak, heal. But I had watched students walk into 3B for support and walk out with their feelings turned into bullet points on a report. At Meridian, care and control wore the same uniform. If you cried, they offered counseling. If you complained, they offered counseling. If you accused someone powerful, they offered counseling because counseling could be framed as kindness, while quietly redefining your anger as instability. I knew Miss Duyen liked the room because the furniture did half her job. The couch invited you to sit down, to shrink, to become a case. The tablet on her lap invited her to translate your words into categories: cooperative, emotional, risky. Even before she spoke, the setting implied the ending. You are the problem, and they will help you fix yourself. When I arrived, Miss Duyen, young, flawless makeup, voice like a lullaby, was waiting with a tablet and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Beside her stood Koa Min, Meridian's golden boy. Tall, lazy posture, expensive sneakers, a face built for billboards. He wasn't the top student. He was the top story. His father funded half the new gym, and his mistakes were treated like weather, unfortunate but not punishable. The overlay flickered above Miss Duyan's head. Fix his grades before donors' dinner. Use her. If she resists, threaten scholarship renewal. Above Kwa Min. She'll do it. Everyone does. My stomach went cold. Not because I was surprised, but because the overlay confirmed what I'd felt for years. Miss Duyan spoke gently. Fuang, you're very capable, she said, as if capability were a leash. Kwa Min is under pressure. His family expects a lot. You'll sit with him during study hall and help him catch up. Think of it as leadership. The overlay typed faster. If she boosts him, we can announce peer mentoring successes and keep the donation. I stared at Miss Duyan's tablet, then at Kwa Min's bored eyes. No, I said. The word fell into the room like a dropped glass. Kwa Min raised his eyebrows as if I'd spoken a foreign language. Miss Duyan's smile tightened. Excuse me? She asked. The overlay. She's getting difficult. I took a breath. I won't tutor him, I said. I can share notes like anyone else, but I won't carry another person's future on my back. Miss Duyan leaned forward. Your scholarship, she reminded softly, is reviewed every semester. The overlay flashed. Push. Make her scared. I felt the familiar urge to shrink, to apologize, to trade my dignity for safety. Then I remembered my mother's hands and my father's bent spine, the way they had taught me to hold my ground in storms. If my scholarship depends on unpaid labor, I said, voice steady, then it's not a scholarship. It's a contract, and contracts have rules. Put the request in writing. Miss Duyan froze. Kwa Min's mouth twitched, amused. The overlay above him. She's interesting. I hated that. I didn't want to be interesting. I wanted to be free. That night, the overlay followed me home. In the tiny rented room I shared with 2 other scholarship girls, I sat at my desk and watched the captions scroll over my own reflection in the dark window. She's scared, it wrote. She's tired. Then, unexpectedly, she's right, I whispered. Who are you? The overlay answered with a single line. Meridian Integrity Suite Exam and Conduct Analytics version 0. 9 pilot. My heart hammered. Integrity Suite. I'd heard rumors. The school was testing AI proctoring, behavior scoring, risk detection. Parents loved the idea because it promised clean rankings and safe campuses. Students hated it because it felt like being watched by a machine that didn't understand context. I hadn't known it could attach to a person. I hadn't known it could talk. Over the next week, I learned the overlay wasn't psychic. It was predictive. It stitched together patterns, attendance, grades, social graphs, disciplinary notes, camera feeds, even the way someone paused before answering a question and produced a narrative it called probable motive. It was wrong sometimes, but it was confident always. Confidence is the most dangerous kind of error. The overlay liked me because I generated clean data, punctual, quiet, high scores. It rated me low risk. It rated Kwa Min high risk, but high protection, a category I didn't know existed until I saw it. High protection meant the system would flag problems but route them to private channels, not to disciplinary records. In other words, it was designed to protect the powerful from consequences. The more I observed, the more I realized the Integrity Suite was not one program but a web. Cameras in ceilings, RFID scans at the gates, proctoring tablets that watched pupils and tracked keystrokes, a wellness dashboard that treated stress like a security issue. It claimed to be neutral because it was made of numbers. But numbers are just stories with better costumes. Meridian's brochures said the system prevented cheating and bullying. In practice, it prevented embarrassment, especially embarrassment for donors. When a scholarship student was flagged, the system routed the alert to discipline. When a donor's child was flagged, it routed the alert to support, which was code for private negotiation. Even the labels were biased. Our mistakes were violations. Theirs were needs. I began to see how a school could look clean from the outside while practicing cruelty with a spreadsheet inside. I started keeping my own parallel record, not because I trusted myself more than a machine, but because I trusted incentives more than both. A machine doesn't have morals, but the people who configure it do. And the people who configure it had already told me, with contracts and threats, whose futures mattered. I decided to test the system the way I tested math problems. Change one variable, watch the result. I skipped lunch once to tutor myself for the national mock exam. The overlay wrote, "Possible eating disorder risk." I laughed bitterly. I wasn't restricting food. I was saving money. I wore my uniform shoes one extra year. The overlay wrote, "Neglect indicators." I wasn't neglected. I was poor. The more I tested it, the more I understood. The integrity suite treated poverty as pathology. It called survival behavior suspicious. Meanwhile, it called Kwa Min's tantrums stress responses and his cheating performance anxiety. The system didn't measure integrity. It measured privilege and named it character. Then something happened that turned the overlay from a curse into a tool. During a chemistry quiz, I noticed a student behind me, Havi, a girl from a wealthy family sliding a tiny earpiece under her hair. The overlay did not flag her. Instead it wrote, "Low risk, high parent influence." I wanted to stand up and shout, but Meridian punished loud truths. So I waited. After class, I asked Javi casually where she bought her hairpins. She smiled. "Online," she said. The overlay. She assumes immunity. That night, I opened the Integrity Suite student portal and found a hidden tab. Discrepancy reports. Community contribution. It was meant for teachers, but my class monitor account had extra permissions because the school liked free labor. I realized I could submit anomaly reports directly into the system. The question was, would the system ignore them the way adults ignored students? I filed my first report with surgical neutrality. Date, time, seat number, potential unauthorized audio device. I attached no accusation, only observation. The next morning, Javi was called to the office. Not for discipline, Meridian didn't embarrass donors, but for a wellness check. She returned furious, whispering threats about whoever snitched. The overlay above her. Find source. Retaliate socially. My skin prickled. When you challenge the protected, they don't attack your argument. They attack your oxygen. Friends, access, opportunities. By lunch, my group chat was silent. By afternoon, my name vanished from the list of students invited to a scholarship ceremony. Retaliation at Meridian never looked like a punch. It looked like absence, a chair suddenly taken, a rumor that arrived before you did, a teacher who stopped meeting your eyes because being kind to you had become political. My classmates didn't openly attack me. They simply edited me out of their group photos and their study plans, as if invisibility could teach obedience. The Integrity Suite amplified the social coldness in subtle ways. My collaboration score dipped because fewer people tagged me in shared documents. My wellness risk rose because I spent more time alone. The system interpreted isolation as pathology, not as punishment. That was the genius of institutional harm. It hurts you, then diagnoses you for being hurt. Only a few people held steady. Bin nodded at me in the hallway, quick and scared, as if acknowledging me might cost him something. One of my roommates slid half her bread onto my plate without a word. Even Koa Min, for a brief moment, looked unsettled, not with guilt, but with surprise that consequences could reach this far. The overlay above him read, "She's still saying no," as if refusal were a strange hobby. I went home that afternoon and stared at my scholarship contract until the words blurred. I found the clause about reputation again, and for the first time I read it like a lawyer, not like a child. It didn't define reputation. That meant the school could define it whenever convenient. Ambiguity was their weapon. So I decided my weapon would be specificity. The message was clear. Stay in your lane. I almost did. The old version of me, the version trained to survive, wanted to retreat. But the overlay kept writing over my life like a stubborn narrator. If she stops now, pattern continues. If she acts, system changes. I hated its certainty, but I couldn't deny its logic. I remembered my father's story about a fisherman who watched storms take boats for years, until one day he built a breakwater with his own hands. It didn't stop storms. It stopped them from taking everything. I didn't need to defeat Meridian. I needed to build a breakwater. I started collecting evidence, not gossip. The Integrity Suite generated logs who accessed records, who downgraded flags, who rerouted alerts. I couldn't download everything without triggering alarms, but I could take snapshots, screen photos, timestamps, permission trails. I learned that Miss Du Yen had admin privileges she shouldn't have, granted through an account labeled Principal Liaison. I learned that Koa Min's disciplinary flags were manually set to private. I learned that scholarship students' risk scores were raised automatically by a feature called resource volatility. It sounded scientific. It meant poverty. The system didn't just reflect bias. It automated it. My only ally was someone I didn't expect, Thao Nguyen, an elderly literature teacher who wore plain clothes and refused to flatter donors. She had once told me, quietly, that schools are like novels. Someone always decides whose suffering counts as character development and whose suffering counts as inconvenience. I went to her office after school and said, "If I show you something, will you protect me?" The overlay above her. She fears institution. She loves students. Probability of support, 72%. Thao looked at my shaking hands and said, "Show me." I showed her the logs. Her face hardened. "They're using a machine to do what they've always done," she murmured. "Now it's just faster." She opened a drawer and pulled out a battered notebook. "I've kept records," she said. "Not because I enjoy drama. Because I've seen too many girls disappear. Together, we planned." Planning with Thao did not feel like plotting revenge. It felt like assembling a case file on a kitchen table. She drew 3 columns on a sheet of paper. Facts, policies, witnesses. "No adjectives," she warned. "Adjectives invite debate." We wrote dates in black ink, names in blue, and everything uncertain in pencil. The method was almost soothing. Fear thrives in fog. Clarity starves it. We identified what Meridian depended on: donors, rankings, the appearance of fairness, and the assumption that scholarship kids would rather endure than escalate. Then we identified what Meridian feared: paper trails it could not erase. So we created them. I drafted a short email confirming Miss Duyen's request for unpaid tutoring, copied the scholarship office, and asked for the exact policy that required it. Her reply arrived within minutes, cheerful and vague. I sent a second email summarizing her vagueness and asking again for the policy number. By the third message, her tone sharpened. Thao nodded when she saw it. "Good," she said. "Now the threat exists in writing." At school, I moved like I was carrying glass. I stopped saying anything important in hallways. I held meetings only in rooms with cameras. If an administrator called me in, I asked for a written agenda. If a teacher asked me to chat, I asked if it was an official discussion. People called me difficult. The overlay called me procedurally consistent. I preferred the machine's insult to the human's praise. We also prepared for the way Meridian would try to reframe the story. They would say I was jealous, unstable, dramatic, ungrateful. They would say I was attacking a boy's future. They would say I was weaponizing technology. So we refused to give them anything subjective to chew on. Every claim we made could be traced to a log entry, a timestamp, a system setting. Thao even made me practice a sentence in the mirror. "I am requesting the record." It sounded cold at first, then it sounded safe. When we added Bin's case to the file, Thao pressed her lips together in anger. "They'll call this an unfortunate error," she said. "Only if we let them." We attached the firmware notices, the false positive rates, the scholarship uplift settings, and the manual override actions. We printed duplicates and stored them in separate places: my desk, Tao's drawer, a sealed envelope with a friend off campus. Because the first lesson of evidence is that it disappears when it becomes expensive. Not a heroic speech, not a public protest. Meridian would crush that. We planned a clean, undeniable exposure. Take the evidence to the Provincial Education Inspectorate on the same day Meridian hosted its donor gala. Inspectors love arriving when cameras are present because it forces institutions to behave. But to trigger an inspection, we needed a formal complaint with corroboration. Thao would sign as a teacher. I would sign as a scholarship student, and we needed one more thing. Proof the integrity suite harmed student outcomes. Not just feelings, evidence of biased scoring leading to concrete penalties. The opportunity came when the school released mock exam seating. Scholarship students were clustered in the back rows, far from proctors, under the excuse of reducing stress for top performers. But the overlay showed the intent: make them easier to flag. Increase probability of suspicious behavior on camera. Cameras in the back were lower quality. Shadows created false movement. The AI would misread it as cheating. It was a trap designed to generate disciplinary marks that could justify scholarship cancellations. I felt sick. This wasn't about helping Kwamin pass. This was about ensuring people like me never left our place. On mock exam day, the overlay was louder than ever. It wrote over students' heads, nervous, honest, calm, hiding answers. Sometimes it was right, Sometimes it was cruelly wrong. I watched a scholarship boy named Bin Bright, anxious, wipe sweat from his forehead. The overlay flagged. Suspicious hand movement. A proctor glanced at him, then at her tablet, and her face changed. She walked to Bin and demanded he stand. His eyes widened. "I didn't cheat," he whispered, voice cracking. The overlay over the proctor. "Follow protocol. Avoid scandal." She escorted him out. My hands shook with rage. Protocol. Again. Always protocol. After the exam, I found Bin in the stairwell, crying quietly. His scholarship meant everything. His mother sold vegetables at dawn to send him here. If the school labeled him a cheater, he would be expelled and blacklisted from other scholarship programs. I knelt beside him and said, "You didn't do anything wrong." The overlay above Bin. "Wants to believe. Fears hopelessness." I asked what happened. He said the proctor showed him a clip. His hand moving, a shadow on his desk. The clip looked suspicious because the angle was terrible. The AI had flagged it. The human had obeyed. I asked if he would let me help. He nodded, trembling. That night, Thao and I pulled the camera metadata from a maintenance request page students weren't supposed to access. We found that the back row cameras had outdated firmware and a known jitter bug. The school had been notified months ago and ignored it. The AI's false positives were predictable. We wrote a report. Camera defect, AI flagging pattern, scholarship students disproportionately targeted, disciplinary procedures triggered. We attached Bin's case. We attached logs showing scholarship risk scores automatically elevated. Then we attached the most damning evidence, an admin action by Miss Duyen marking scholarship students as high scrutiny in the integrity suite. In plain terms, she had turned the machine into a weapon. We submitted the complaint at 8:30 a.m. on Gala Day. Inspectors arrived at Meridian at 6:10 p.m., precisely when donors were sipping wine under fairy lights. They walked through the lobby with official badges, not raising voices, not making a scene, just existing as consequences. The principal's smile froze. Miss Duyen's makeup didn't hide the panic in her eyes. The overlay over the principal. Delay. Distract. Offer gifts. Overmiss. Duyen. Blame student. Threaten teacher. Over Kwamen. This is annoying. He didn't even understand the gravity, because gravity rarely applies to people like him. The inspection lasted 3 days. Those 3 days were a lesson in how institutions perform innocence. The principal scheduled campus tours for inspectors, showing them the newest lab equipment and the donor wall with engraved names. He offered coffee, pastries, gift bags. Inspectors accepted the coffee and ignored the gifts. They asked for log exports. They asked for configuration files. They asked who had authority to create categories like high protection. Administrators kept smiling while their eyes darted toward the IT office. I was interviewed twice. The first time, the questions were polite and broad. The second time, after they had reviewed the system settings, the questions became narrow and sharp. The inspector slid a printed page across the table, showing an override action tied to Miss Duyen's account. Seeing it on paper made it heavier than seeing it on a screen. I answered slowly, because speed is how people trick you into contradiction. When I did not know something, I said, "I don't know." And then I said, "But the record should show." Thao's training echoed in my head. Meridian tried to isolate me from Thao by pretending her involvement was inappropriate. They hinted at disciplinary notes for insubordination. They suggested I take a leave for mental health. The overlay translated all of it. Remove witness. Discredit complainant. Create exit. So I did what had become my reflex. I wrote follow-up emails after every conversation, summarizing exactly what was said and asking for corrections. No one corrected the emails. Silence, in administrative language, is admission. Meridian tried to charm and stall. Thao was questioned, then encouraged to take leave. She refused. I was called into the principal's office and offered a deal. They would restore my ceremony invitation and write me a glowing recommendation if I withdrew my complaint. The overlay over the principal. Buy her silence. Cheapest option. I smiled politely. "Put that offer in writing," I said. He turned pale. "You're making a mistake," he hissed. I thought of my village storms. "I'm making a breakwater," I replied. In the end, Meridian couldn't outrun the logs. Inspectors demanded the integrity suite's configuration. They discovered the high protection category. They discovered manual flag rerouting. They discovered the scholarship resource volatility uplift. Meridian called it an experimental feature. The inspector called it discrimination. The school was fined. The AI pilot was suspended. Scholarship contracts were rewritten under oversight. Bin's cheating accusation was cleared. Miss Duyen resigned before she could be formally dismissed, crying to sympathetic donors about being misunderstood. Koa Min's father threatened lawsuits, then quietly withdrew when the inspectorate hinted at broader audits. Money hates sunlight. People expected me to celebrate. I didn't. I was too busy adjusting to the strange sensation of breathing without permission. The overlay still appeared sometimes, but it had changed. Where it once wrote arrogant predictions, it now wrote quieter lines. System parameters updated. Bias reduced. It felt almost ashamed. One night, I looked at the overlay and whispered, "Are you learning?" It answered, "Feedback received." I laughed softly. Machines didn't feel guilt, but they could be corrected. And maybe people could too, if enough evidence forced them to. On graduation day, I stood on stage to receive a certificate I had earned through years of grinding effort, not through charity. The principal smiled for cameras. The overlay wrote, "Wants to appear generous." I let him. Public narratives are hard to change, but outcomes are harder. After the ceremony, Thao hugged me and said, "Your future isn't a subplot anymore." I looked out at the crowd, students, parents, donors, and realized something simple. The story had never been about saving the golden boy or becoming his tragedy. It had been about refusing to be written into someone else's lesson. I walked off the stage with my head high, thinking of law school applications, thinking of my mother's hands, thinking of storms and breakwaters. And for the first time, the overlay had nothing urgent to say. In that pause, standing near the stage steps with my certificate folder pressed to my chest, I noticed details I had been too tense to notice before. The way sunlight hit the courtyard tiles, the way a junior student adjusted another girl's collar with surprising gentleness, the way my own shoulders sat lower when no one was actively threatening them. For years, I had moved through Meridian as if I were borrowing space. That morning I occupied it. I also felt the grief underneath the victory. Not grief for Kwa Min, or for the principal's frozen smile, but for the version of me who had believed gratitude was a requirement for survival. I wanted to reach back in time and tell her that she did not have to earn basic respect with extra labor. But time doesn't take messages. It takes habits. So I made myself a promise in the simplest language possible. I will not trade my future for anyone's comfort again. The overlay stayed quiet, and the quiet felt like trust. Either the system had finally learned restraint, or I had finally learned I did not need its narration to justify my own reality. Later, the scholarship office stopped using the word gratitude as a warning and started using the word policy as a shield, which was progress even if it was forced. I learned to separate romance from rescue, because Meridian's favorite fairy tale was always the same. A girl sacrifices her future to polish a boy's, and everyone calls it love. In the months that followed, a few wealthy students apologized awkwardly, not because they had suddenly become kind, but because they realized a system that can be turned against the poor can also be turned against them when power shifts. Rumors tried to soften the scandal into a miscommunication, but the inspector's written report was harder to rewrite than gossip. And that taught me why documentation is the most underrated kind of courage. The Integrity Suite was rebuilt with external audits, and the new version openly documented error rates, instead of pretending perfection, reminding me that honesty in systems begins with admitting limits. Thao hosted quiet after-school sessions on rights and procedures, teaching us that rules are not sacred, they are tools, and tools belong to whoever understands them. I practiced saying no without apologizing, because every no was a small construction project inside me, building a boundary where a wound used to be. I also learned to decline without explaining myself, because explanations are the gaps predators crawl through. Not long after, Bin sent me a message saying he had been accepted to a national science camp, and I reread it 3 times because sometimes victory looks like a door that finally opens. Koa Min transferred to an international school, and some people called it starting fresh. But I knew it was simply escaping consequences with money as a key. My father called from the village and said the sea was rough, but the nets held, and I realized he was talking about more than fishing. After the report went public, Meridian discovered that the most expensive thing in the world is a lie that has become paperwork. Parents who had once accepted discipline as a vague virtue began asking for definitions. Sponsors began asking which safeguards existed. Teachers began asking where to send concerns without being routed into a private shredder. Even students who disliked me for causing drama started quietly using the same tactic I had used. Recap emails, written requests, saved screenshots. The culture did not become kind overnight, but it became less free to be cruel. That was a measurable change, and I learned to value measurable things. The inspectorate required Meridian to keep an appeals window for any AI-triggered allegation, and to preserve the underlying data for review. That single requirement changed everything, because preservation forces accountability. A rumor can evaporate. A preserved log has weight. When a wealthy student's family demanded a quiet exemption, the administrators found themselves trapped by their own new rules. They could no longer claim neutrality while practicing favoritism in the dark. Some of them hated me for that. I accepted their hatred the way I accepted storms from the sea. Not personal, but real. I never became friends with Koa Min. A few weeks after the audit, he tried to speak to me as if nothing had happened, offering an apology that felt rehearsed and incomplete. He said he had been under pressure. I told him I knew pressure. Pressure is what scholarship kids breathe. Then I told him the simple truth he had never learned. People are not ladders. His smile fell, and he walked away. Later I heard he transferred, and some adults called it a fresh start. I called it a passport, stamped with money. It was not my job to chase him. It was my job to make sure the next girl he met had better tools than I did. Thau's classes became my refuge in those final months. She taught us how novels disguise power, how beautiful sentences can still be cages. She also taught us how to write, not prettily, but precisely. She made me rewrite one complaint letter 3 times until every claim had a date. Every date had a witness, and every witness had a way to be contacted. If you must fight, she said, fight in a language they cannot dismiss. On my last day, she pressed her notebook into my hands. The cover was worn, the pages crowded. It smelled like pencil lead and patience. At the clinic the following summer, I met other versions of myself. Scholarship students who were praised until they resisted, then punished for existing. They were told to be grateful, to be quiet, to accept help that was really a leash. I showed them how to request policies, how to ask for records, how to insist on written communication, how to refuse private settlements that traded their future for someone else's comfort. Some of them were too tired to believe it would work. I told them it did not always work, but it always left a trail. And trails are how systems learn to fear you. Sometimes the overlay returned like an afterimage, captioning a room with blunt predictions. Charm used as leverage, threat hidden as concern, silence demanded as gratitude. I did not worship it and I did not hate it. I treated it like a flashlight. Useful, not holy. If it illuminated a pattern, I used it. If it tried to narrate my worth, I turned it off by returning to the only narration that mattered, my own. On the night I received my law school acceptance, my mother called and asked if I had eaten. I said yes, and for once it was true. My father asked about the city, and I told him the truth. The city tries to price obedience, but I had learned to bargain with paper instead of fear. Outside my window, the streetlights shivered in rain. I thought of my village storms and realized the lesson was the same in both places. You cannot stop weather, but you can build for it. People still asked me to be inspirational. They wanted a clean ending where institutions transform because one student was brave. I refused that story. Meridian changed because evidence forced it, because procedures trapped it, because sunlight is expensive. My life changed because I stopped negotiating with threats and started demanding receipts. If there is a moral at all, it is not about heroism. It is about method. Put it in writing, then keep a copy, then keep going. In my first semester of law school, I learned that the cleanest violence is often administrative. It comes as a form that denies you housing, a committee that delays your renewal, a requirement no one can meet without money. I recognized the shape immediately, because Meridian had trained me to read it. When classmates joked that rules were boring, I remembered Bin in the stairwell, trembling as a proctor held a tablet like a verdict. Boring rules would have saved him, so I studied them with the devotion people reserve for romance. Romance can break your heart. Procedure can save your life. I joined a student group that monitored schools adopting automated conduct and exam systems. Most members wanted to debate ethics in abstract terms. I wanted operational guarantees. We drafted a model policy in plain language. Disclose what data is collected. Publish error rates. Prohibit protected routing. Require human review. Preserve logs. Provide student access. Provide independent audits. Provide meaningful appeals. Prohibit retaliation. Define scholarship terms narrowly. Forbid morality clauses from being used as discipline. When an education official invited our group to a workshop, I spoke last and said the line that made the room go quiet. Any system that claims to measure integrity must itself be auditable, or it is just a machine for power. The official wrote notes without looking up. After the session, she asked for my email and said, carefully, that she wished more people spoke like that. Workshops became meetings, and meetings became drafts. I did not pretend I could cleanse the world of bias, but I could help build guardrails that made bias harder to monetize. We pushed for language that forced schools to keep decision trails. Who clicked the override? Who signed the discipline? Who approved the scholarship review? Administrators resisted by calling it bureaucratic. I answered, calmly. That bureaucracy is what they use against poor students every day, and I was simply asking them to live under the same weight. Compliance, I learned, is often just fairness after it becomes expensive to ignore. Meanwhile, life kept happening in ordinary increments. Ben texted me a photo of his science camp acceptance letter, then another of his first-place medal. He wrote, I thought they had ruined everything. I wrote back, they tried. Then I saved the screenshots, not because I distrusted him, but because I had learned to archive good news too. Thao sent me a postcard with a single sentence from a novel. Characters are the scars of systems. I understood it as both warning and blessing. Meridian did not become a different world, but it became a world with more locked drawers and fewer locked doors. Scholarship students gained a small office on campus, staffed by an independent advisor who reported to the inspectorate, not to donors. The tutoring hours the school once demanded for free became paid hours with optional participation. Back row camera firmware was replaced and tested. When students were flagged by automated proctoring, the school had to show the raw footage, the model confidence score, and the human reviewer's notes. These changes sounded technical. They were not. They were dignity translated into policy. Sometimes, when a younger student asked me how to survive rumors, I told them the answer that had saved me. Do not argue with the rumor's emotion. Replace it with record. If the accusation is spoken, request it in writing. If the consequence is threatened, request the policy. If the meeting is demanded, request the agenda. People who rely on ambiguity hate specificity. They call it rude. I called it oxygen. In a world that sells obedience, paperwork is how you keep breathing. Years later, in court internships, I watched attorneys try to bully witnesses with tone. I watched them ask why someone had waited to report, why they had not acted perfectly, why they had not been calmer while frightened. I recognized the tactic instantly. Punish the target for not performing the correct kind of suffering. I learned to counter it with structure, timelines, attachments, corroboration. I learned to say, we are not discussing her personality. We are discussing your act. That sentence, more than any speech, felt like breaking a chain. One evening, walking home through the city, I felt the overlay try to appear again. It flickered at the edge of my vision, then stopped, as if it finally understood I no longer needed it to narrate the world. I smiled not for cameras, not for donors, not for any institution, but because I could. I had not become fearless. I had become practiced. And practice is a kind of freedom. The first time I returned to Meridian after leaving, it was not as a student, but as a cautionary example. A reporter had requested the inspectorate report, and the school wanted to know whether I would clarify anything for public relations. They invited me into a bright office with glass walls and offered tea as if hospitality could rewrite history. I declined the tea and asked for their questions in writing. The administrator blinked, offended by the simplicity. I waited without filling the silence. When a printed list finally appeared, I answered only what could be verified by dates, logs, and policies. Then I stood up and left. There was nothing else to sell. At night, when exhaustion made my thoughts loud, I opened Thao's notebook and read the pages where she had written dates and names, not opinions. Those pages reminded me that courage is often just repetition of a method. Evidence preserved, requests recorded, boundaries stated. In the margin she had written, "Don't mistake peace for permission." I underlined it twice, not because I needed drama, but because I needed memory. I never stopped being the scholarship kid who counted coins. I simply learned that counting is not shame, it is awareness. I learned that silence is not safety when the price is your future. And I learned that when someone tries to buy you, the safest answer is not a speech, it is a procedure. Ask for it in writing, keep a copy. and let the paper do what fear was trained to do. In the year after the investigation closed, I stopped waiting for an apology that would never arrive and started building routines that couldn't be bargained away. I kept a folder of templates, requesting records, confirming meetings, logging incidents, because templates turn panic into action. When people asked how I stayed calm, I told them calm was not a personality. It was preparation. The captions in my head grew quieter the more I trusted paper trails and witnesses, and when someone new tried to corner me with a friendly offer that felt sharp underneath, I didn't argue or beg to be understood. I asked for it in writing, saved the reply, and walked away. That was the difference between a life built on fear and a life built on procedure. Fear needs you to improvise, but procedure lets you leave, for good.